Welcome, everyone. I'm Kelly Hancock. I'm the Director of Programs at the American Civil War Museum. We have 3 sites that we operate. My background that you're seeing is our beautiful lobby at our museum in Richmond at Historic Tredegar, newest museum. We also operate the Historic White House of the Confederacy in Richmond and a museum out in Appomattox. We've got 3 different sites and are very pleased to be welcoming you to our virtual world tonight. And before I introduce our guest author, I have, as always, I've got some updates on what we're doing at the museum. Our next in-person program is going to be on March 14th. We'll have Alexander Rossino in Appomattox with us, speaking on his book, Calamity at Frederick, Robert E. Lee Special Order number 191 and Confederate Misfortune on the Road to Antietam. And then rounding out the month of March, we'll be kicking off our Civil War and Remaking America spring lecture series on the eve of war. And over the next 3 months, we'll look at 3 different individuals. And for March 21st, we'll have Dr. Elizabeth Leonard with us to speak on Benjamin Franklin Butler, A Noisy, Fearless Life. And coming up in April, we'll have David Blight on Frederick Douglass. And then in May, we'll have Barton Myers on someone that doesn't get a lot of press, General Winfield Scott. So mark your calendars for all of those programs that are coming up. And then I'll mention too that April is a busy month. We are gearing up for Civil War and Emancipation Day in Richmond. We'll have Springfield's Lincoln Fritz Klein with us all day. So you'll get to hear from Abe Lincoln himself. We'll also have John White, who has written a children's book, My Day with Abe Lincoln. He'll be on site doing special programming for children. And we'll also have the Green Machine 7-piece regimental band from George Mason. And then out in Appomattox, of course, this is April 6th, and then out in Appomattox on April 13th for Freedom Day and commemoration of the surrender, we'll have Elizabeth Barron speaking on James Longstreet. We'll have members of the 5th United States Colored Troop speaking on and doing presentations on the African American history or experience during the Civil War. We'll also have living history in the cabin and on site exploring domestic and military life, skirmish, cannon firing. So if you're near either of our sites, I would make plans to join us for those April events. And finally, one last announcement before I turn the screen over to our guest author. Our next virtual program will be on April 18th, and we will have John Hopkins with us speaking on The World Will Never See the Like, the Gettysburg Reunion of 1913. So lots of good stuff coming up. There's never a dull moment when it comes to being here at the American Civil War Museum. And now, for tonight, I am very pleased to introduce Victor Vignola. He is a lifelong student of the Civil War and has written articles for publication in North and South Magazine, as well as other forums. He delivers historical programs, conducts tours, and regularly visits his Civil War sites. Vic's career included executive-level labor and interagency relations for the Office of Mental Health in the state of New York. He lives with his family in Orange County, New York, the home of the 124th New York Orange Blossoms Regiment. And he's here tonight to speak on his book, Contrast in Command, which won the Fletcher Pratt Award and is also a finalist for the American Battlefield Trust Military History Book Award. So if you could clap, I would have you give a warm welcome to our guest author. Yeah, there we go. I see some. And with that, I'm going to turn, I'll unpin myself, mute myself, and turn the screen over.
Okay, so I'm doing a share screen here. Is that what I do? And then let's make sure. Oh, there we are. There we are. Okay, can everybody hear me okay? I hope. Well, let's get started. So, folks, thank you very much for being here tonight. As you can see, if you want to jot down my contact information, feel free to send me an email or text or a phone call if you need to. My book is called Contrast and Command, as Kelly said, the Battle of Fair Oaks, May 31, June 1, 1862. And I'm very proud of my book and the fact that it's gotten the recognition that it has. However, I'm more proud of the fact that the 12 acres, which is the center of the battlefield, the previous owner, she was gracious enough to sell her property to the trust. That is now hallowed ground. It's preserved ground, and hopefully the trust is going to be doing something with it soon. But that picture you see there of the Adams house is a reconstructed house. It's not the original Adams house that I'm going to be talking about during my presentation tonight. However, it sits on the original foundations, and it is a primary character in the story as we move forward. Now, for the most part, the Battle of Seven Pines and Fair Oaks is known by most people for one thing. That's where a guy by the name of Joseph E. Johnston was wounded. And because of his wounding, Robert E. Lee arose to command, and thus began the Civil War for many people as far as where their studies began. However, as you will see tonight, there was a whole lot more to the story. Bull Sumner, it turned out to be his most glorious day as a commander in the second of the Second Corps in the Army of Potomac, and it was quite a thrilling day that he had. But as far as the name of the battle, it's either Seven Pines or Fair Oaks. So now, which is it? So, well, let's talk about that. Well, Joseph E. Johnston, he would write later that the Battle of Seven Pines or Fair Oaks, as Northern people prefer to call it, no action of the war has been so little understood as that of Seven Pines. Well, the person that's primary culprit for why this battle is so little understood is Joseph E. Johnston, the other being James Longstreet. Bull Sumner, when he was testifying before the Joint Committee for the Conduct of the Civil War, a panelist said to him, "General, the Battle of Fair Oaks or Seven Pines, they are the same thing under those two names, as I understand." And Sumner bristled. He said, "Oh, no, sir. They are two distinct places. The battle of which I commanded on Saturday and Sunday was at Fair Oaks. The Battle of Seven Pines was a separate battle, and General Heintzelman commanded there." Well, it wasn't a separate battle. However, there were two sectors to this battle, and as you will see as we move forward, what that means. Here we go, my screen. There we go. Now, as you can see, there's the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, and flowing diagonally across it is the Chickahominy River. The Chickahominy is going to play a major role in our story as we move forward, but how the Army of the Potomac wound up here squaring off against Johnston's forces all began with the Peninsula Campaign beginning in April of 1862. And by the middle of May, the forces had reached back to the Chickahominy River. There's the Battle of Williamsburg on May the 5th, and shortly thereafter, Johnston moved his force to the western bank or southern bank of the Chickahominy River, using the river as a barrier between him and the Army of Potomac. Now, on the 20th, as you can see with the cursor here at Bottom's Bridge, the Fourth Corps began crossing at this location to get on the southern bank of the Chickahominy. And by the 28th, they had moved out with the Fourth Corps to the Seven Pines intersection, which is a Williamsburg Road and 9 Mile Road. The Third Corps crossed on May the 23rd. So two corps by the 28th of May were located south of the river. So by May 30th, this is what the positions look like. And let me break them down for you. McClellan had an army of 5 corps. The 5th Corps under Fitzjohn Porter was located near Mechanicsville, and that position is where the battle would later be fought of Beaver Dam Creek and that area is where Porter's men were positioned. The 6th Corps was opposite New Bridge Crossing, which was a primary and important crossing. But if you jump across the river, you'll see Keyes. Erasmus Keyes' 4th Corps was located here at Seven Pines. And there was 2 divisions in his corps, Silas Casey commanding 1 division and Darius Couch the other. The division's total by this time in May was only down to about 12,500 men. Illness and defections and desertions had plagued his division, yet Casey's division was the most rawest of the raw, so to speak, as far as men composing the army. They were at the tip of the spear at the furthest most advanced point. Darius Couch's division was supporting him. And then a flaw in the deployment. There was a gap of over 3 miles back to where Samuel Heinzelman's 3rd Corps was located with Philip Harney and Joseph Hooker. And this deployment would play a major role in our story. Bull Sumner's 2nd Corps was left on the northern side or eastern side of the Chickahominy River, and his 2 divisions were John Sedgwick and Israel Richardson. On May 30th, however, at this time, he had already been constructing bridges, but he was moved here on May the 25th. And when he was moved here, these bridges did not exist. For Sumner, who was supposed to support Keyes, in order to reach Keyes, his men would have to come all the way down to the Williamsburg Road and then march out, arriving in Keyes's rear. There was a distance of approximately 12 miles. Sumner decided that's too far for his men to go to be in support position, so he wanted 2 bridges to be built, and he summoned 2 of his colonels to his office to begin bridge construction. And one of them, this is the famous picture you've seen, it's called the Grapevine Bridge. It was built by the 5th New Hampshire by Colonel Edward Cross. Those of you familiar with Gettysburg are very familiar with where his stone is located there. But one thing I want to inform you about as far as the Grapevine Bridge goes, what you see here, the bridge itself spanned a distance of approximately 1,200 feet, 1,200 yards, excuse me. So it was a long bridge. And the thing that confuses people is, well, what is it about the Chickahominy? Well, the Chickahominy is really a river that is going to be a river that is just a floodplain with a swamp on either side of it. And those swamps on either side of it are full of undergrowth and just a swampy, infested area, difficult to traverse. So it required corduroying of a road or bridging to actually get across it. And what you see here, if I were to tell you that the Chickahominy Bridge was 1,200 yards long, you'd say, oh my God, that's a long bridge. But most of it was corduroy. So there was only about 30 feet of it, or approximately 10 to 20 yards of it, that was actually bridged. The rest of it was corduroy road, which was a causeway. And what Cross's men did is when they cut down the trees so that the stumps were of equal height, and then they laid the stumps across those piers, using them as piers and supporting them with the men using grapevines and ropes to tether it together. And as you can see on the bottom here, not a pin, dowel, bolt, or nail entered into its construction. That flexibility that this would cause the bridge to have would be proven in a couple of days when the battle would occur. Now, if we look on the Confederate side, Confederate Army at that time had approximately 85,000 men. Robert E. Lee had marshaled together reinforcements from throughout the South. And what you see pictured on this map here is about 65 to 70,000 of the Confederate forces in and around the Richmond area. And the battle that we're going to talk about on the 31st had its genesis actually on May the 28th. Johnston had already made a plan to make an attack at John Porter's position. He was going to use the division of Gustavus Smith and A.P. Hill to attack Porter's position on the morning of May the 29th. However, at a council of war on May the 28th, the decision was made to call the attack off, primarily by Smith beseeching Johnston not to make the attack. And by doing so, that infuriated James Longstreet. Longstreet, later on that night, met with Johnston and explained to him how had he, Longstreet, been in charge of making this attack, it would have been successful, and it would have carried glory both to them and the Confederate cause. But nonetheless, the attack does not happen on the 29th. But on the 29th, D.H. Hill, down here on the Williamsburg Road, does probes at Keyes's 4th Corps position. And he also does another probe on the 30th. From his 2 probes, he sends back information to Johnston that Keyes is vulnerable and he can be taken with a strong attack. Johnston that afternoon meets with Longstreet in his headquarters, and the 2 men meet for hours, and this is the plan. I'm going to boil it down for you that they come up with. Longstreet is to move his 6 brigades east along the 9-mile road to a position here called Old Tavern. Oops, I went back. I'm going to go back one. To a position here called Old Tavern. From there, that'll place him squarely on the right flank of Keyes's 4th Corps. Benjamin Huger will move his 6,200 men down to Charles City Road, and making them on the left flank of Keyes's 4th Corps. As soon as Huger's division arrives, Robert Rhodes will join D.H. Hill's division, now approximately 10,500 men. Once Rhodes's division joins Hill, Hill will launch an attack along the Williamsburg Road, striking Keyes's 4th Corps in its front. When the sounds of fighting begin emanating to the area, Longstreet will then launch an attack with 13,800 men down the 9-mile road, striking them on the flank. So front and flank, the Confederates will be striking an exposed corps of approximately 12,500 men. And after they deal with them, they will then move on and strike Heintzelman. That's what the plan is. It's a simple plan. I oversimplified it, but that's what the plan is. The 2 men break up from their discussion of what they're going to do. And as they break up their meeting, a storm strikes the area. And it's not just any storm. It's a storm that it was described in some accounts as being biblical in proportions. Another described it as a flood falling from the sky. And finally, E.P. Alexander, the famous Confederate, wrote that his entire service during the Civil War, the most violent and strong thunderstorm he experienced during the entire war was on the night of May the 30th into the early morning hours of May the 31st. In other words, folks, you had one of those storms up in the Richmond area where it just rained. One account said approximately 6 inches of rain fell between 4 o'clock p.m. and midnight. So that gives you an idea of the intensity of the rainfall. And since it had rained for 7 of the previous 11 days, the entire area was covered in water, which meant that the Chickahominy River was now in flood stage, and all the streams in the area were also banked full. But nonetheless, shortly after midnight, the storm stopped. The men started moving to their positions, and the next morning, the attack was still scheduled to be undertaken. However, there was a problem. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the attack had not started, and by 9 o'clock, Johnston's getting nervous because now he's getting information that he doesn't know where Longstreet is. Longstreet, rather than moving east along the 9-mile road to Old Tavern, actually went south towards the Williamsburg Road. In doing so, he came across and cut off Huger's division before it crossed. There's a crucial crossing here at Gillies Creek. It's still in the area. But with all the development there, you will never find where it is. But it's in that part of the basin down. I forget the name of the road right now, but it is still in that area. But Longstreet, by crossing his division, had delayed Huger from crossing his. And in doing so, he threw the whole attack plan off. Worse, Longstreet did not inform Johnston of where he was, what his status was, or whether or not the attack was proceeding. In the meantime, with Johnston being totally in the dark, not knowing where Longstreet is, he comments to a staff officer, "I wish the troops had remained in their camps." Well, finally, around 10:30, word is received that Huger has crossed Gillies Creek and is on his way to Charles City Road. Hill sends a rider down the roads and tells him, "Don't wait for Huger. You get up here, and as soon as you do, I'm going to start the attack." And that's precisely what he does. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Hill strikes the front of Keyes's 4th Corps, striking Casey's division in its front. He initially deploys three of his brigades rather, Robert Rhodes, Samuel Garland, and Gabriel Rains. Soon afterwards, George Anderson's brigade also joins into the fight. Casey's men actually put up a decent fight for a period of time, enough so that Hill realizes that there's a gap on the right flank of the Fourth Corps, but he doesn't have enough men to exploit it. So he sends back word to Longstreet to send up a brigade, which Longstreet does. He sends up Anderson's brigade, Richard Anderson's brigade, and that brigade is broken into two. Part of the brigade is sent along the Williamsburg Road. The other part of the brigade, under Micah Jenkins, meets with Hill here on the Williamsburg Road. And Hill describes to Jenkins that he wants him to find the right flank of the Federal Army, cut across through the Army, across the 9 Mile Road, down into their rear. And by doing so, it'll unhinge the front of the Federal forces that are putting up such stiff resistance. And that's precisely what Jenkins does. He undertakes his two regiments, as well as some other regiments that joined him from Anderson, and they attack the right flank. At the same time that Jenkins was meeting with Hill on the Williamsburg Road, over here on the 9 Mile Road, Erasmus Keyes and Darius Couch are meeting. And Keyes orders Couch to bring some of his regiments forward to try to plug this hole before it can be exploited much further. Couch advances with the 61st Pennsylvania and the 23rd Pennsylvania. The 67th New York is also coming up just as Jenkins strikes them in flank in front. Jenkins steamrolls the 61st Pennsylvania to the point where all of its line officers, they're down to their most senior captain who's in charge of the regiment, are killed, wounded, captured, definitely out of the fight. Out of the 550 men the 61st Pennsylvania brought in, approximately 290 of them are casualties. The 23rd Pennsylvania is also heavily pummeled. Jenkins is doing exactly what he was ordered to do. He crushes through this right flank, gets across the 9 Mile Road, and starts to move down towards the right rear of the Federal defenses. And he has unhinged the front, driving these men back into their second line. Now think of this for a second, folks. Who was supposed to be coming down this road with 13,000 men? Longstreet. Who came across here with 1,300 men and unhinged the entire right flank of the Fourth Corps? Micah Jenkins. Had Longstreet done what he was supposed to do, or had Johnston released another division that was available to him, we'll get to that in a minute, this right flank would have been totally crushed by 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Couch falls back towards the Fair Oaks Station Depot. Some of the men from the 61st fall back with him. Others fall back with the 23rd Pennsylvania. But at that time, it's a mess for the Federal forces. So let me just encapsulate what's gone on here. Jenkins has moved through. He's crushed that right flank. The Fourth Corps is in deep trouble. The Third Corps is now starting to respond to try to buttress this front line. Just imagine, like I said, had there been another force coming down this line at this time, it would have been total mayhem for the Third and the Fourth Corps. But let's recap where we're at. Couch falls back with some of the remnants from the 61st Pennsylvania. And what does he do? He finds 4 regiments there under command of John Abercrombie, approximately 2,000 men, and they have 4 artillery pieces with them. And those 4 artillery pieces they have, Couch knows and all of his men know that they are totally cut off. At this point of the battle, it is said that Keyes would later write, at this point, and you can see it here, my right was on ground that was so favorable to the approach of the enemy and so far from the Chickahominy River that if Johnston had then attacked, and he's talking about this time, I could have made but a feeble defense comparatively, and every man of us would have been killed, captured, or driven into the swamps or river before any assistance could have reached us. This is a crucial moment. Couch is here with less than 2,000 men. They're cut off. The sounds of fighting are going behind them to the rear and to their left. The Third Corps is trying to buttress this line. They are in deep trouble. But now let's flash across. Before we flash across, though, Couch realizes he can't hold this position. But he also realizes Sumner has built these bridges and that Sumner is the kind of guy that'll come to his aid. Couch calls over a staff officer, a man by the name Captain William Van Ness, and he tells Van Ness, I want you to ride and ride for your life to those bridges. And if Sumner has crossed, you tell him I get over here. I need him. So off goes Van Ness, and we're going to go off that way too. 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Sumner is having lunch here at the Tyler House with Sedgwick and Richardson. And at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, when the sounds of fighting so clearly came across the river and struck Sumner's ears, it is said that the sounds went directly from his ears, directly to his heart, and he immediately told Sedgwick and Richardson, form your divisions, but form them at the bridgeheads and await my orders to cross. That was a crucial decision Sumner made on his own. He did get word from McClellan to form his division in this corps, but he made that decision to form them at the bridgeheads alone. Saved him well over an hour's worth of time, and it was a crucial moment in the fighting. Finally, at 2:30, right about the time that Jenkins is breaking through over here, is when the order comes for Sumner to cross the bridges. And when he does, he tells his men cross. And leading the way is Gormans Brigade, Willis Gormans Brigade, and leading their way is the 1st Minnesota, who you're very familiar with from Gettysburg fame, from the charge they made on July 2nd there. The 1st Minnesota, as they look across this bridge, they look across a 1,200-yard bridge that they can see bobbing and weaving and dicing back and forth with floodwaters, rising it up and down. Remember, the grapevines that held it together and the ropes that held it together gave it flexibility that it did not break up. But yet these young Minnesotans are being told to walk across a bridge across a flooded river that was moving. It took a lot of guts to do that, but yet nonetheless they went. And what observers would later account that as the men started walking across the bridge, the weight of the men settled it down onto those piers. Remember those piers that had been built to be the base of the bridge, settled it down on those piers, and the men got all the way across. But once they got across, they ran into a slurry of mud on the western bank. And then an artillery battery was also crossed under Edmund Ned Kirby. His 6 guns began also crossing this bridge. And when their horses reached the other side of the bridge into that mud and muck, the horses all sank up to their girths. Kirby had to have his horses unhinged from or unharnessed and led through the mud. They attached prolonged ropes to each of the guns, and some men stacked their weapons, got in the mud and the muck, while others were turning the wheels, men were lifting the barrels, and others were pulling on the prolonged ropes, and they dragged those 6 guns, and they dragged all those caissons and limbers through the mud to the other side. It's an incredible story, sheer determination of those men to get to the other side to go help their brothers, and saving those guns and bringing those guns would play a pivotal role as we move forward in the story. Now let's go over here and talk about Johnston. Remember before I said he had a division here that he could have moved hours earlier, but he did not. And it would be a crucial mistake. One of the reasons he didn't move this division was because those very same sounds of fighting that Sumner could hear so clearly heading towards the northwest did not travel almost due north to where Johnston was located. It was known as an acoustic shadow. There was no sounds of fighting that were heard, even though this is less than 3 miles in distance. It's about 2.5 miles worth of distance. They couldn't hear the sounds of fighting that were emanating so nearby. But nonetheless, Johnston has a division here. It's actually Gustavus Woodson Smith's division, but it's under command of William H.C. Whiting. It's 4 brigades. Actually, I'm sorry, 5 brigades. And of the 5 brigades that are there, it's 11,200 men. And they're there waiting orders to move out. But around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a note arrives to the headquarters from Longstreet. And the note tells Johnston that Longstreet is driving the Federals away and victory will soon be theirs if he is joined on his right flank to drive the Federals out. He also promises victory by the end of the night, that they can drive the Federals into the Chickahominy before nightfall comes. That's all Johnston needs to hear, because In his presence at this time is Robert E. Lee looking over his shoulder. And here coming riding from the city of Richmond is Jefferson Davis, an entourage of politicians from the city of Richmond. So Johnston figures now's a good time to get out of here. So he orders his men forward to move out down this 9-mile road and begin their advance towards the Federal position. Now you see these 4 dots that are here. These are 2 companies from the 61st Pennsylvania, those that they weren't happy with the assignment earlier in the morning when they were put out on picket duty here on the 9-mile road, but it saved them probably from death of being out here where Jenkins slaughtered the rest of the brigade or the regiment. But these 2 companies are under command of a young man, a young captain by the name of Robert Orr. If there's any hockey fans out there, it's not the Robert Orr that is in hockey fame. This Robert Orr would later earn the Medal of Honor at the breakthrough at Petersburg on April 2nd, 1865, excuse me. He's here with his men and he sees this moving out of a large Confederate force coming down the road. He realizes he must get back and tell Couch and Abercrombie that they're soon going to have visitors. In the meantime, Couch and Abercrombie have already determined they cannot defend this position. It's too flat. It has no defensible flanks. However, there's a slight ridge line here near the Adams house. And that slight ridge line would be defensible because it would control anyone attempting to cross the 9-mile road at this intersection with the railroad. They're making the decision to move towards that position when here comes Orr telling Couch and Abercrombie that the Confederates are right behind him. They move out and they move to the slight eminence. Now, the photo on the right, present day, this is Hanover Road. Those are familiar in that area of where Hanover Road is, outside of Sandston. Half-mile away down here where the cursor is, that's where the railroad depot would be. And this little slight rise in the road is where Couch and Abercrombie were moving that small brigade, that demi-brigade of men were moving in this direction. On the left-hand side, you can see the photo that's mislabeled. It says Williamsburg Road. This shows the open fields that were here at the time. The woods that were here were present at that time. But that's the position that Abercrombie's moving to and Couch is moving to. But still, they know that they do not have enough men to hold this position. And it is about this time, as they're moving down this road, the Confederates make a decision that's going to be pivotal. 2 decisions, actually. Johnston, first of all, decides he doesn't really know where Longstreet is. So he dispatches a brigade under John Bell Hood to find Longstreet's flank. And once he determines where the flank is, to send back a rider to advise Johnston, and then he'll bring the rest of the division there. So Hood, with 1,900 men, is dispatched on a mission to find Longstreet because Longstreet didn't think enough to tell the boss where he actually was located. The other problem is Johnston, when he's moving his division down the road here, Whiting's division, he decided to advance without artillery. He said, the roads are too nasty, they're too messy, we're going to move without the artillery. They can follow after we move the men. Crucial mistake. As you can see here, the 6th North Carolina, they are leading the way. They're the skirmish regiment. They're under command of William Dorsey Pender, who's a colonel at this time, and they're leading the way as they're moving through these fields. There's federal camps here. Those men are going through the camps, picking out some extra accoutrements as they move in this direction towards the railroad. Following them is a Vanderlaw. He's leading a brigade, and right in the rear of that brigade is Johnston and Whiting riding on their horses. J. Johnston Pettigrew's brigade follows behind that. A little bit further back, a half-mile away, is Gustavus Smith. It's his division, but he's not leading at the front. He decided he would take a position towards the rear. He's about a half-mile away. Colonel Wade Hampton and Brigadier General Robert Hatton's brigades are following. As these men are moving in this direction, Whiting senses there's activity going on of half a mile away on that slight ridge line, and he gets nervous. He begins men that are going to be on his flank and rear, and he sends a rider forward to tell Pender and Law to stop. When the rider makes it to Law, and Law's brigade stop, but the rider doesn't make it to Pender in time. As the rider is not making it to Pender, a young Lieutenant Alfonso Avery is his name, of the 6th North Carolina. He senses all this movement up here and he calls out to Pender, "Colonel, there's Yankee flags to our left." And with that, Pender orders by the right flank, charge bayonets. And the Confederates are soon going to start charging across this field. But before we get to that, Couch and Abercrombie are forming here, and they know they don't have enough men. They have 4 guns that can help control this intersection, but he knows he doesn't have enough men to seal the position. As they're forming and wondering what's going on, here comes Van Ness riding back on his horse, and he tells Couch, it's going to sound like Hollywood, folks, but it's documented. He tells Couch, "Here comes Sumner. He's right behind me, and he'll soon be here." Couch turns around and sees Gorman and Sumner leading the 1st Minnesota, who are running through the fields at the double quick, heading their way. There's Kirby's men slapping the horses to get their guns moving forward. The entire brigade of Gormans is moving fastly in their way. Couch then turns to Abercrombie and says, "I know now God is with us and victory will soon be ours," because he knows he can now hold the position. And with that, that's what happens. That's when now the Confederates are advancing across this field. As soon as Law sees the Pender form his regiment and advance in this direction, he forms his entire brigade. You have approximately 2,500 men who are advancing across this field. It's a very dynamic time as they're advancing across this field. Gorman's brigade is arriving. Kirby's guns are arriving. You can just imagine, had Sumner been a half hour late, or had Johnston been a half hour earlier, we wouldn't have a book to be talking about in this context. It would be completely different. So what you can see, here's what it looks like coming up that slight eminence. Over here, this is where 2 of the guns would have been located, right in the middle of the road. Kirby's guns, as they arrive over here towards where this blue house is, and that White House in the background. That's where he starts posting his guns. Pender's men are coming from the right. Law's men are coming from the left. These 2 guns that are here are Andrew Fagan's guns, and here comes Kirby's guns as well. And as you can see here, the battery shakes the ground with its rapid discharges. And a couple of the Confederate accounts of this moment, Pender would report, "The fire of the Yankee batteries was so unexpected and so severe that my right soon gave way and broke, and I couldn't rally it immediately." Another man from from Law's brigade wrote, "The Yankees opened immediately with a heavy and destructive gunfire on us, and they also fired their artillery batteries with great effect, and we had no artillery with which to engage them." Remember, there's 0 artillery here for the Confederates, and it's going to be a crucial mistake that was made by Johnston in making the commands he did. The Confederates fall back and they reform quickly, and then they start a second advance. As they are advancing in the second advance, the rest of Gorman's brigade is forming, as well as Burns's brigade. Philadelphia Brigade is arriving on the scene. So you can see it's a very dynamic time. But before I get into the second attack, just understand it was Evander Law, J. Johnston Pettigrew, and Hampton's brigade that's now making the attack. These 3 brigades combined for well over 7,500 men are advancing across the field to press basically the 2,000-man brigade being reinforced regularly by another 2,500 men. So they're still outnumbered, but the artillery pieces are going to have a lot to say about that. But there's a crucial piece here. See the stream over here on the left? This stream, in my book, I just call it a nameless stream because that's what it is. This shaped the battlefield. Remember the storm that fell from the sky. Remember the biblical proportions rain. Well, it completely flooded this stream to the point where it shaped the battlefield. So much so that one of the Confederates would later write that our column moved across a lagoon and across through the edge of a dense wood. And when I was doing the research on this, Pettigrew's men talked about a swamp. But Hampton's guys talked about a lagoon. This lagoon comment appears 5 times from this young man's account. It's James Bell is how you pronounce his name. And that nameless stream is still there today. It runs through a housing development into a culvert that runs into a cul-de-sac of a housing development. And as you can see from an old period map, how that stretches right down well into the battlefield. And what's important to understand about that is that it shaped the Confederate attack lines. On the right-hand side is a double worm fence, one of those high worm fences, approximately 6 to 7 feet high, which is not easy to cross. And on the other side of the line, where you had this lagoon, the Confederates had to funnel into the center. So they're moving into an attack front of approximately 350 yards in width. Then that's where they're advancing into. As Abercrombie is forming his line, the 1st Minnesota, when they arrive, and their colonel, Alfred Sully, he realizes he can't be flanked. He sees this lagoon out here too. So he takes 3 of his companies and faces them to the front and swings 7 companies down so that they can provide enfilade fire down the line. Sumner, when he arrives, he immediately dispatches 2 guns over to the right. And these 2 guns under James Brady, the captain, would provide artillery fire on his right flank of those 2 pieces, which the Confederates called a battery that wielded destructive force throughout the fighting. So his 2 guns appeared to be a battery to these attacking Confederates. Then along this line, these men here, the 2 companies of the 61st Pennsylvania, whatever regiment or whatever guys fell back, the 65th New York and the 31st Pennsylvania, approximately 1,200 men threw up stones and logs and whatever they could, and they laid down behind it and inflicted a destructive fire on the Confederates as they were advancing. On the other side of the road, Kirby initially arrived with 3 guns, Fagan's 2 guns, and as the 82nd New York and 34th New York arrived, Sumner swung them down. So that basically what he has done is he has created an inverted salient. In other words, all of the gunfire and artillery fire from the Union was concentrated into this 350-yard front, and it was deadly into the Confederate forces that were advancing through it. Let me read you a couple of accounts here. One young fellow from Pettigrew's brigade, right in this area, he wrote, and just think of this, these guys only had minutes to throw these stones and logs up. He says, the enemy were in rifle pits, and their fire appeared to come up out of the ground, and it came out in one continuous stream. Their fire was not in successive cracks, and neither would the usual term used by historians, the roll of musketry, apply. No, sir, it was the sound of one continuous roar, a peal of thunder that lasted for more than half an hour. You can imagine the pure hell in those men. Another fellow wrote, from Hampton's Legion, wrote, the Yankees presented the appearance of a living wall of flame from the great number and rapidity of their gun charges. And my favorite quote is by a young fellow by the name of B.F. Moody from Pettigrew's 35th Georgia. He wrote in his letter to his wife on June the 2nd, so very fresh in his mind. June the 2nd, he wrote to his wife, I have hived bees, but they weren't nearly as half as thick as the balls that were flying through the air as we advanced. So you can imagine the impact on these young men. It is during this advance that Pettigrew was wounded. I put it here. I don't know exactly where it happened. It happened somewhere while he was leading his brigade through the woods and the mayhem that's here. He's struck in the shoulder, and the bullet actually comes out through his neck. Missed his carotid, but it caused such bleeding that he thought the wound was mortal, and he thought he was going to die. And as the men were attempting to remove him, he said, no, leave me here, continue with the fight. We must win the day. They left him, and he was captured, and he was later taken to the Adams house, where he would convalesce for 2 nights before he was sent across the river to Dr. Gaines's house. But he would be captured and taken to the Adams house. That's another part of the significance of this piece of property. But the second advance that occurs by the Confederates is a deadly one, because as I said, as the Confederates are advancing, the Union line is getting stronger by the moment. Sumner is bolstering up these flanks, and they're really delivering a high volume of fire into the Confederate forces. And then here's a picture of Hampton, who's in this attack. As I mentioned, Pettigrew was wounded. Sergeant Andrew Byrne, if you read my book, his quotes that he talks about the fighting. He's an Irishman. He served in our country not once, but twice. And he was highly effective. He was wounded at Malvern Hill. He served in the prison at Libby prison, released from there. And then he was wounded again at Cedar Creek, and he was eventually discharged and wound up going back to Ireland, where he wound up being arrested for causing a lot of turbulence there. But he's quite a young man. His story is quite fulfilling. And there's Alfred Sully, who deployed his men so well. So as this second advance is continuing, Gustavus Woodson Smith is back here, and he's watching this, and he's realizing his division is getting pummeled and getting pummeled badly. So he also realizes that he must do something to stop the bleeding. So he rides forward to see what he can do, and he gathers information from Hampton. Hampton feels with another solid push to the front, they can drive the Federals off and they can win the day. So a third attack is ordered. Brought forth is Robert Hatton's Tennessean Brigade, as well as the 22nd North Carolina. And the impetus of the attack now is to drive towards this apex. If they can drive through the apex where the artillery pieces are located, they can win the day, and that will achieve victory for the Confederates. Meantime, the 20th Massachusetts and 7th Michigan from Napoleon Dana's brigade is also arriving, and they're extending the line. It's during this fight now that it is starting to get dark, and men are just totally out of sync. There's intermingling going on all over the place. John Bell, the fellow that wrote about the Lagoon, said the condition of the air was such that the smoke of the battle settled low over the field, and I could only now see the blaze of guns and the flashes of rifles. Another wrote that the light of the evening was lurid from the blaze of the hostile guns, and the multitudinous of the messengers of death were thicker than raindrops in a tropical storm. And then finally, Theodore Barker from Hampton's Legion talked about the artillery and the musketry fire that was being delivered on them. He said, a most murderous fire of grape, canister, and musketry opened upon us. I cannot pretend to describe it. The shot and shell mowed through our ranks. Well, seated on his horse in front of the Adams house is the chaplain from the 1st Minnesota. His name is Edward Neal. And he's watching these artillerists bang away at the advancing Confederates. And he's so moved by it that he wrote, the rapidity of the loading and firing of the guns sounded like the incessant pounding of a great steam boiler shop, and it excited the attention and admiration of all those who witnessed it. So you can just imagine what the impact was on those men. It's at this time that Confederates now realize they cannot drive the line forward. It is also at this time that Hatton, who is riding alongside of Gustavus Smith during this attack, he's killed. And what happens is, he's not the only one killed. Senior line officers on the Confederate end, their losses are incredible. Champion Davis, who is in charge of the 16th North Carolina, he's killed during the advance. Gustavus Bull, 35th Georgia, he's mortally wounded. He's taken from the field, taken to the Adams house. He dies that night. He's buried in one of the mass graves. His personal effects are returned to his family, but his body is never discovered. Robert Hatton, as I mentioned, he is killed during that final advance. And it is also during this final advance that Hampton sustains a wound that breaks his ankle. John Riker is the only federal line officer who is killed during this attack. He is killed defending the guns of Andrew Fagan's guns. It is during a final push by the Confederates that Riker is killed, but it is after that attack is repulsed that Sumner now turns to Gorman and says it is time to go from the defensive to the offensive, mount a counterattack, and he orders a counterattack, and the whole line surges forward, driving the Confederates back. And it is a sight that one young fellow, Henry Lyon of the 34th New York, wrote, "We advance forward with a bayonet. It is a sight that one will not be apt to forget in one's lifetime. We charged them in mud that in places our legs were a half leg deep. We felt a total disregard of danger, and our feelings of revenge towards the enemy converts a man into being a demon." Lieutenant Henry Ropes was with the 20th Massachusetts. When the order was given, this was his first fight, Ropes' first fight, first encounter of battle. He's 21 years old. He writes, "Sumner gave the order for the whole in line to advance together, and we did so at the double quick, charging with a bayonet and making a tremendous cheer. It was a great sight, dark with smoke and lit up with the fire of the guns and line of bayonets that stretched as far as the eye could see, and they surged forward." Well, it's during the surge forward that actually Johnston is wounded. He's wounded during this final advance. An artillery shell explodes nearby. He's also struck with a gunshot wound, and it's at this time that he falls. And at this moment, he's down. Lee comes over to him. Jefferson Davis comes over to him. They put him in an ambulance, as not them personally, but they were among the men that made sure they were put in an ambulance. As they're moving up this road, out of the woods comes Gustavus Smith, the only general of the three that actually was involved in the fighting that day. And Davis asks Smith, "What are your plans to return to the attack?" So Smith, all of a sudden he's in charge of the army, and he's expected to make an attack only by the President of the Confederate States of America. So obviously we'll talk about that in a minute, but at any rate, that's the pressure that he's under. But this counterattack is greatly successful. Henry Abbott of the 20th Massachusetts, a veteran of Ball's Bluff, the disaster, he wrote to his family on June the 5th, "You have no idea what a glorious feeling of victory brings. We were almost drunk with joy and so hoarse from cheering that we could hardly speak." Well, the battle was done for that day. And as you can see on the Confederate side, they lost 1,339 men, even though it says 11,200 total. Remember, 1,900 weren't there. So 9,300 men, 1,339 killed, wounded, were missing on that fight. Over here on the Federal side, 459 were their losses. But you want to talk about how strong that position was of the 1st Minnesota. They couldn't be touched on that flank position. They had 2 killed and 2 wounded. But since we're talking about contrasts in command, George Mindle, who earned a Medal of Honor at Williamsburg, he wrote, "Had Johnston's plan been fully executed as to time and place as contemplated, the left wing of McClellan's army would have sustained irreparable disaster, and the retreat of the whole army would have followed." Think of the disaster this would have been. Right at the same time, Stonewall Jackson is making all kinds of mayhem in the Harper's Ferry area. Washington, D.C. is all apoplectic over that Jackson may be coming down the streets. Stanton is already worried about, do we have enough men here to defend the Capitol? Had there been a loss in the peninsula that would have coincided with that loss, it would have been a massive, massive political turmoil as well as military turmoil in the North. And then Edward P. Alexander, he would say Johnston's effort to handle the battle had been a total and utter failure. His orders were to concentrate 23 of his 27 brigades against McClellan's left wing, yet nowhere were ever more than 4 brigades in action at one time. Johnston did a miserable job. An utter failure is being kind to him as well as to Longstreet, as well as far as his command. So who's the hero? Well, Bull Sumner. Remember, he mobilized his corps before he had to. He had them move to the bridges and then move them across, and they got there precisely at the minute they needed to get there. And then he deployed his 2 divisions in a way that defied the Confederates to continue the attack. Look at this position. He created another salient, but in this part of the salient here, there's 24 artillery pieces. No one's going to come down the 9-mile road, and no one's going to come across them at this direction. The rest of his division is deployed along the railroad on a high ground that was there. The 3rd and 4th Corps pretty much, although Birney is part of the 3rd Corps, his brigade is out here also. There was this gap, and the Confederates position, think of this being a shoe. If you think of this being a foot in a shoe, the Confederates were actually the foot, and the Union position was the tongue of the shoe, the toe of the shoe, and basically the sole of the shoe. The Confederates had no places to go. But yet the expectation was for the attack to be renewed June the 1st. And even though it was a position that was impossible, and I don't think Smith nor Longstreet really understood how bad this position was, the attack was renewed the next day, and it was a disaster. George Pickett and Lou Armistead both attacked the center of the Second Corps. Everybody thinks that happened on July 3rd, 1863. Well, it actually happened first on June the 1st, 1862. They both attacked the Second Corps that day as well. However, Armistead's men got demolished and immediately fell back. Billy Mahone's brigade came forward. You also had Roger Pryor's brigade and Cadmus Wilcox's brigade involved in the action. This was a fight that really did not have to occur. However, it did. And during this, I show this for a little bit of comic relief because it shows Brigadier General Oliver Otis Howard, who says, "We pressed our way over uneven ground. Howard took his men from the right position and brought them into the center and mounted an attack onto the Confederate position. Billy Mahone's brigade primarily was his opposition. But if you'll notice, here's Howard with two arms. That's because at 10 o'clock in the morning of June the 1st, his elbow on the right elbow stopped a bullet, and that bullet was later deemed to cause the amputation of his arm, which occurred in the Adams house later on that evening at 5 o'clock in the evening of June the 1st. His arm was amputated. So we're almost done. Here's the final tally, and I break things up by sector because I call it the Fair Oaks sector and the Seven Pines sector. You can see everything that early on where D.H. Hill was involved with Micah Jenkins. That's the Seven Pines sector. But there's a lot more casualties there. As you can see, 7,000 casualties in the Seven Pines sector. The Fair Oaks sector, still significant casualties. In the June 1st fight, look at those casualties that are 2,198. Including the Federals having more than the Confederates as near as we can tell. But overall, the losses for this battle were 11,168. This is 7 weeks, folks, after the fighting at Shiloh, where there was 23,000 casualties. This battle was 11 hours, 11,000 casualties. Shiloh, 23 hours, 23,000 casualties. Think of the message this sent to the American public, that they now know they're in for a serious war. So yes, June the 1st, Robert E. Lee is promoted into command of Confederate forces. And for many people, that's all they're going to know about this battle. But I think you found out a little bit more about it tonight. So here's an old picture of the Adams house, the original Adams house before it burned down and was replaced. And this tree that's here is a witness tree, and we've verified that it was one of the witness trees of the trees that were planted. You can see these other ones, they're all gone now, of course, but there was one tree that still survives to this day. This field looks towards the Adams house. There's the Adams, the witness tree. When we talk about where Sumner arrived with Gorman, follow the cursor, you see these pine trees. He actually came in this direction. Couch and Abercrombie were initially set up in this direction. So when Couch looked back and saw Sumner coming through the fields, he actually saw him coming from this direction here, which was cleared at the time. Over here on the left, this where the cursor is now, that would have been about the most left position of one of Kirby's batteries. The 82nd New York would have been in position here, the 34th New York offline. The 15th Massachusetts would have been somewhere in this area, the 7th Massachusetts, the 62nd New York, and walking right across the front of you. Remember, we talked about the 20th Massachusetts and 7th Michigan extending the flank. They would have walked right across the front of you, folks, had you been here at that time to witness them passing through. And here, remember I mentioned Edward Neal seated on his horse. He would have been seated on his horse somewhere in this area here at the original house. And this position was taken from where one of the most left guns was of the Kirby's battery. So this is how close he would have been to actually observing the guns. And once again, Sumner and Couch, Sumner's men would have entered from this position back here. This is turning around, looking at the Adams house, facing the other way is where the Confederate battle lines would have been coming from. So that outstanding looking individual right there is yours truly. Again, my contact information is at the bottom of this page. I want to once again thank you all for attending. Ted Savis said to send his regards and to thank you all also for attending as well. The thing I'm proudest of with this book isn't so much the fact that the book is written and so well received. I'm proudest of the fact that through these efforts, we're able to get 12 acres of ground preserved, where if you know anything about Seven Pines, Fair Oaks Battlefield, there was 0 preserved before. There's 12 acres now, and that's a good thing. So with that, I'll be quiet and let you people ask me all the questions you want. I think, Kelly, you're going to fire away on those?
Yes, I can definitely do that. And thank you so much. Excellent presentation, a lot to take in. So for those of you who watched tonight and want to know more, definitely think about buying that book, and you can get it either through Savis Beatty or you can get it through our gift shop. If you're a member of the museum, we'll give you 10% off. And I do think we had some questions, so I'm kind of pulling these up here. We also had some applause from one of our viewers. So I'm sorting through here. So the first question is from Niels. He says, I'm curious about why Longstreet blundered so much at Seven Pines and during the 7 days battles, considering how effective he became as Lee's subordinate in subsequent campaigns.
Well, that's the $1 million question. It's a great question. I take Longstreet to task rather heavily in my book. He and Johnston, basically, for lack of a better term, conspired to place the blame of the failure at Seven Pines onto Benjamin Huger. Longstreet, I only covered what Longstreet did poorly on May the 31st. He also performed poorly on June the 1st. He never really commanded. He did not. And Johnston, just to let you know, well, why Johnston let him get away with it? Because Longstreet was, Johnston gave Longstreet verbal orders. So it's all going to reflect on Johnston, his poor management as well. So if you understand the two personalities of Johnston and Longstreet, both very prideful men, both very protective of their image and what their perception of them would be. By either of them, by Johnston blaming Longstreet, he's in effect blaming himself, because why didn't you follow up more? Why didn't you send out more people to find out what was going on? You had the opportunity to still command down that road, but you didn't. And yet Longstreet, despite all the things that he blustered about that he allegedly did, there's no documentation that he ever gave any orders at all. In fact, he later wrote to D.H. Hill that he never gave an order that day. Everything that was done that day, he says, was done by Hill. So those two men, basically to protect themselves, blamed Benjamin Huger for all the failures of command that day. And it's one of the undertold stories. I think I tell it pretty well in this book as far as how they destroyed Huger. I'm right now researching Seven Pines, and I tell you, it's not going to get any better for Longstreet or Johnston than my Seven Pines book.
Very interesting. And kind of on that note of just like looking at different generals, Michael asked, why did Grant think Johnston was such a good general if he seems he frequently failed?
Because it makes Grant look better, doesn't it? Some of the toughest pitchers I ever faced are the ones I hit the best off of. You know what I mean? The ones that I couldn't even touch. It was like, well, he had a good breaking ball, but I wasn't feeling well that day. No, I honestly think that it goes back to understanding command issues. That by complimenting Johnston, they basically compliment themselves for the strategies that they were employing against Johnston. Like for Sherman to compliment Johnston, it means that Sherman's campaign on the march to the sea or to Atlanta, well, why did he take the tactics he did? Could he have done other tactics? Or was it just basically by complimenting Johnston, he's basically complimenting himself? Um, Dr. McMurray rather, has an interesting thought on that as well. And he believes pretty much the same thing, that a lot of the federal praise for Johnston came post-war and came basically by the men who also seemed to profit by the fact that they praised him so much.
Well, that's an interesting observation too. So we've got another question. Since McClellan's army was advancing on Richmond by fits and starts up until the battle, do you think that Seven Pines effectively brought a halt to his advance and played a role in his decision to settle in for a siege instead of seizing the initiative?
Wow, that's a great question too. I'm going to try to take that apart in pieces. As I said, I'm working on my Seven Pines book now, and I'm really digging into a lot of threads that they were there. It's just that a lot of historians and authors are basically lazy. If somebody else has written it and all I have to do is copy and paste it and go with that theme, it's easier for me to write. But when you actually get in and dig into the stuff, there's so much post-war analysis that McClellan did that isn't supported by what he was actually doing in May of 1862. So he talks about how he really intended on doing a base of operations on the James River. Well, he never said that in May of 1862. He said that after 7 days after he had had that destructive campaign there. So he was moving. Here's my opinion. He was so distracted by Lincoln in the McDowell transfer of troops. He was so focused on his right, meaning McClellan, was so focused on his right that he forgot his left. And one of the reasons he forgot his left was because he was under the impression by Johnston that Johnston, and if you looked at that first map I had up there, Johnston was heavily slanted. His left was heavily slanted towards McClellan's right, up towards the Fifth Corps, Beaver Dam Creek, in that area. So that's one of the reasons why he neglected McClellan, why he neglected his left. The other reason is because he needed that railroad to extend the railroad, to bring the railroad through so he could advance his supplies. His men were sick, they were poorly fed, and they were having difficulties slogging through that mud. The men would go sometimes, in cases, days without eating. So that railroad was important to bring forth supplies. But he got piggish. What happened is that the perfect place for him to operate out of at this point, south of the river, was Savage Station. But he decided to extend to Fair Oaks Depot. And by extending to Fair Oaks Depot, you know what? By extending to Fair Oaks Depot, what he did, let me go back and just show you. By him extending to Fair Oaks Depot, he actually went a little bit too far. Here's Fair Oaks Station Depot. His original defensive line on May the 28th was right here. That was perfect. He had Savage Station. The railroad could supply the Fourth Corps, the Third Corps, and it provided him a nice defensive position that, should he decide, and this is what he should have done, and I think he was thinking of doing, but we can't say for certain, had Sumner come across, this was a perfect position that he could possibly run an operation up the 9 Mile Road while Franklin advanced across the New Bridge Road, and they could have put pressure here on Old Tavern, then bring the artillery pieces and everything else. That's one of the theories. The other piece is that McClellan got hungry for more ground because Johnston was so docile. He extended Casey a mile past Seven Pines intersection. By doing so, Casey's division was responsible for all the picketing. He now had a 5-mile area of pickets. Every one of his regiments had 3 companies out every day, 3 companies out on picket, 3 companies resting, 3 companies or 4 companies knocking down trees. And plus, men were sick all over the place. He was overextended big time because McClellan wanted to have Fair Oak Station be an extra station so that when he brought more forces across, he had more opportunity to bring uh, supplies through to his men. This was a bad choice. His best choice would have been where he was on May 28th, right here, this line right here, not where Casey is, this line right here with the railroad. He had a nice compact line here, and it gave him options. But he decided to go a step too far, gambling that Johnston was focused up here, not down here. And if you want to know more, you're going to have to read my next book when I write it. Okay. But that's my theory right now, was that this battle happened because McClellan moved too far. He should not have come out this far. He could have stopped here. Had he stopped here, he had a good defensive position. So to the question of, did he get docile? Did McClellan get docile? Yes, he did. Because what happened is, after this fight, this punch in the nose, he decided to dig in and then force um, Lincoln to send more troops to him, more supplies to him. And he was thinking that he was going to be able to build up 3 corps up here, put another 3 corps down here, and eventually move. But as you know, with McClellan, he's never going to move. And he was facing a guy in Johnston who was also never going to move. So fortunately for the Confederates, one of the best shots fired was the one that wounded Johnston, because that's what moved the ball. I hope that answered the question, but great question, but it's not an easy one to answer.
And I think in answering that question, you may have answered this next one, but I'm going to go ahead and read it out just in case there's something more to add to it. And this will be our last question. But Brian says, awesome job. And to paraphrase the Patton move, I read your book. And then he says his great-great-grandfather was with the 101st PVI, is that Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry?
Yes, yeah.
At the time, and then he asked, are you able to frame why the uber cautious McClellan was so careless with his troop dispositions, not just how the Second Corps were left exposed south of the Chickahominy, but them being unseasonably and leaving Casey so exposed 3 miles from Couch's troops.
Yeah.
So troops is a 40+ minute march from support.
Right. There was all kinds of problems. Casey's division was the absolute last choice, should have been the last. It would have been any reasonable person's last choice to be put out in this tip of the spear. Casey's division, I didn't get into this, but his division was formed as the Army of the Potomac was shipping out to Fortress Monroe. What Casey's role was in Washington, D.C., when troops would come in from the north, they would go to Casey. Casey was a master at training troops in the military way and instituting and supervising officers and making sure officers were competent. He had 12 regiments, 8 of which were brand spanking new. So new that many of the officers were totally incompetent. There was not a West Pointer in the bunch. That's part of the problem. When they got to Fortress Monroe, they were the last on the list for everything, for equipment, for food, for tents, for horses, for wagons, for everything. As they moved through the Peninsula campaign, more and more of them got sick. As they got sick, there's one account I have, and this will be in the next book, where the men would actually have houses on the side of the road. They called them death houses. The men were so sick that they would send men there to die. That's how bad it was for Casey's division. His division started out with 15,000 men when it left Washington, D.C., because of desertions and illness and so many other issues. By the time he's here, he's got 5,500 men in line. So that's how bad it is for him. Not only is it bad for him there, he's Couch, and Casey had all sent messages to Heintzelman and to McClellan on May the 28th, saying this division is not combat ready. And IG submitted a report to McClellan on May the 28th, telling McClellan this division is not combat ready. Yet the decision was made to move them out a mile into a position where they are really at the tip of the spear. And now this was the area, you see how my cursor's going. This is the area he was responsible to cover with pickets. I'm sorry.
Wow.
So he had to cover an area with pickets, 3 companies per regiment. And plus all the men that were sick. Also, 3 companies were on picket duty, 3 companies are resting, 4 companies are out cutting down trees and slashings to build up a defensive position. His men were not only not combat ready, they weren't in position to be combat ready on May the 31st. So what happens? The battle happens on May 31st. And what does McClellan do? He blames Casey's men for running from the field because they weren't able to make a stand. When actually the person who is to blame for it is McClellan, because McClellan authorized, even though he had free information that they were in the wrong position, they shouldn't have been there. Keyes, Casey, Couch, and Heintzelman all informed McClellan of the danger of the position that they were in. This, by the way, is not in my Fair Oaks book because at the time I wasn't focusing on this issue. But now that I'm getting into my Seven Pines stuff, it's astounding to me how Casey's men were put in that position, and that there was a gap. Look at that gap. Heintzelman did close the gap somewhat on the morning of May the 31st. He brought part of Kearny's division here closer to Savage's station, so they were only 2 miles away, but still, they were not close enough. Had Sumner not done what he had done, moving forward here, it would have been a disaster. No doubt about it. It would have been a disaster. I hope I haven't bored you guys with my answers, and I hope I haven't brought in too much Seven Pines stuff I'm working on now, but it does explain the question that was just asked though.
Well, the last comment is can't wait for your next book on Seven Pines. So
well, it'll be a wait, but it's I'm working on it hard.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us tonight and sharing from your book. And thank you all out there who tuned in tonight to view this presentation. And a special thank you to those of you who are our members. We couldn't do it without you. We rely on your support. If you're not a member, think about becoming one, because that does help the museum do all the things that we're doing. And once again, thank you so much, Vic, for being here, for sharing from your book.
Thank
and
you. Thanks for having me.
We'll look forward to hearing more from you.
Yeah.
Will come out.
And if you get a chance, if you're in the area, go out on Hanover Road, 231 Hanover Road. You can see the house. It's still there. The 12 acres is Battlefield Trust property. I'm not telling you to go walk around it, but someday you will be able to. And from there, you can piece it all together. I'm glad it's there.
Yeah, that's excellent news too.
Yeah.
Well, good night, everyone.